before we do our big reveal, we have to lay the groundwork because we're bringing information that out of context will not mean anything. Now, speaking broadly, to sort of set your expectations, we're going to be talking about a method of dating events. This is a technology that allows you to put things in temporal context. And I think an analogy that people will find readily available is carbon dating.
Yeah.
Right? Carbon dating uses the decay of an isotope of carbon to allow scientists to date back things thousands of years in the past, because as carbon is assimilated into organisms, they preferentially absorb certain isotopes and then those decay. And if you compare the ratio of isotopes, you can tell how long something's been alive.
If that's a confusing topic to you, you could also think of dendrochronology, which is the study of looking at the pattern of tree rings to determine how old a tree is.
Everything we're going to be putting forward is going to be publicly available information. Everyone is able to look at it and they can form their own judgments. What I'm trying to do here, and we've said this from the very first episode, the first episode was, how do you solve a mystery like this?
Right.
And the answer is, you build carefully, stone upon stone, a solid foundation, building upwards carefully. The other part is that you bring in other expertise. If you don't rely on your own gut feeling or your own intuition or your own understanding, but ask other people, ask people whose knowledge is greater than yours, and bring them in and say, you tell me how this works. And so, we brought in Jim Carlton to talk about Lepas barnacles. We brought in Ken Monroe to talk about the hackability of MH370. We're going to be talking to more people, and I invite people to make their own inquiry. I want this to be reawakened, reopened. I want the officials who are responsible for finding this plane to reassess their own assumptions to understand where they went wrong, because they did not find the plane.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay.
All right, we're talking about Lepas barnacles again.
Okay.
That should be something very familiar to people, because they've heard and learned all about these disgusting little creatures.
Yeah.
This organism we talked about, we met them in episode 18 when we started talking about the flaperon, which was the first
flaperon being that first piece of debris that washed ashore on La Reunion.
Right.
This is the most important piece of debris. It was covered in these juicy barnacles. Lots and there's lots of data, and really when that piece washed ashore, it sort of spurred a renaissance of interest in this particular organism. People realized that these can be used as essentially data trackers.
Yeah, in episode 19 we looked at some of the puzzling aspects of the debris, including the fact that the marine biologists just could not figure out how Lepas could have grown on a part of the flaperon that was so high up in the water. And they did all sorts of modeling, and they did tests and real life tests and laboratory tests, and it still didn't make sense to them. But
this is the perfect example, Andy, of this idea where people encounter a paradox and the officials are just like, well, we can't explain it, but there must be a perfectly logical explanation. I just actually, this morning, I got an email from David Griffin, who is the head of the CSIRO, right? Drifting, studies drifting with the Australian government. And I said to him, how do you explain this? It seems like a paradox. And he said, it's not a paradox. What waves wash over it, and that's how they live, obviously. And we've talked to numerous marine biologists who say that just is not possible. And yet you can just, if you tell yourself, well, it must make sense, therefore it does make sense.
Okay, so if this starts to get confusing to you guys, because now we're going to get really granular here, we'd recommend you go back and watch episode 18, 19, and maybe some of 20 if you want.
We have laid the groundwork. We're going to walk through it in a way that I think has become familiar to our listeners and viewers, which is we're going to try to keep a pace that is like not too boring, but also not confusing. So
the idea is that the Lepas barnacles can be used as a reliable way to measure how long debris has been in the water. Just like we talked about carbon dating, just like we talked about tree rings. Combined with drift modeling, it will tell you when and where something went into the water, which is important because if that plane crashed in the southern Indian Ocean and that debris was found around Madagascar,
Right.
it tells you something. And we're
Right.
going to
So
debunk
what
it.
so the expectation is that every piece that goes in the water, and we've seen this with the tsunami debris, we've seen this with other kinds of objects that go in the water at the same time. Every piece should bear the traces of its voyage through the ocean. When debris goes in the ocean, marine life attaches to it and grows bigger and bigger and bigger. The most common variety in tropical and subtropical waters all around the world is something called the goose barnacle, Lepus anitifera. And we'll just call them lepus. There's different species, but we're going to focus on this one so much to the exclusion of everything else. So it doesn't live everywhere in the world, but it's very happy in waters that are between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius, which is about 68 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is tropical, subtropical. I first got interested in lepus barnacles. I reached out to a woman who lives in Pennsylvania, professor of marine biology named Cynthia Venn. And she told me she's been studying how these things grow on buoys. And so, they put the buoy in the water, it's clean. They come and clean it some months later, and they collect the barnacles and they would give them to her. And she would be able to measure them and take all the properties of them. And so she would see how these things in a very regular way, like clockwork, would get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the thing she said to me is, assuming they have enough food and the temperature is good, barnacles will follow a steady growth progression. So this is that kind of steady, regular behavior that allows us to use them as a kind of clock. Some people will say, well, sometimes like something might come along and eat them all. Or they might just die. They're fragile creatures. They're actually very robust creatures. They've evolved to kind of latch onto things, grow really fast, reproduce, and then life is short in the ocean, and so they've evolved to grow on things like logs that will sink eventually, break up and dissolve. So these things are very robust. You talk to someone like Cynthia Venn who studies these things day in and day out, and they'll say like it is like clockwork. The barnacle shells get bigger. And that's what we use to measure them because they're, they don't change if you dry them out or something. But they also get more dense. So when a piece first gets in, it'll have a one here, one there, like they're kind of scattered. But then as time goes by, more and more of these creatures settle, and it's like a thick forest almost.
Okay, so that leads us to point number 2. You use the analogy that lepus is not like sunflowers, where the deer will come and eat them, and then a new colony.
Yeah, I live in Westchester. I can't grow sunflowers because if I do, the deer will come like right down Main Street and will eat my sunflowers, and there'll be nothing left. I've had this happen before. It's very frustrating.
Yeah.
But it's not like that where your garden will just get cleaned out. Once these things start to grow, it's a robust process. And so I talked to a guy named Scott Bryan who studies pumice. So you have a volcanic explosion in some places like Tonga. It ejects these stones into the air, and they have like bubbles of gas in them. So they're like rocky sponges basically, and they float. They're floating rocks. And so they're great to study how these things, how marine fouling organisms will grow over time. And again, so you see the steady growth. If you see a bunch of pumice stones that all went in the ocean at the same time, you will see consistent behavior of these animals on all of them. And so I broached with him the topic of like, can these things just get like stripped clean just while floating out in the ocean? He said to me, and here's the quote. He said, if there's nothing older than 2 months growing on it, we would interpret this to mean that the pumice had been floating for the ocean for like more than 3 months because it takes a few weeks for the things to get attached. So that would mean that the pumice is fresh in the water, either because of a new eruption or it's been washed back into the ocean. So what the way that these things can get wiped clean is if they go ashore. And we saw this with a roy piece in South Africa.
Yes.
If pieces go ashore, then they can get picked clean. But if they're floating, then they will not hit restart. So that's what I mean when it says like it is a predictable measure of time because these things don't just hit reboot spontaneously.
Okay. Bullet point 3, and that is that scientists use mathematical models to convert their size into their age.
Right.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
The age reveals how long the piece has been in the water.
Right.
So this can be used for all sorts of things. Scientists and studies have looked at how Lepus tracks wildlife endangering ghost nets. They can find missing boats. They can even decipher mysterious deaths.
Yeah.
What's a ghost net?
A ghost net is a fishing net that has been like lost or abandoned. And so it's drifting through the ocean and it's like entangling wildlife. So this is a major drag for conservationists.
Okay.
And so they want to try to figure out where these nets came from. So in a study that a biologist that we're going to be talking to actually is going to tell us how he was trying to figure out where these nets came from. And so he grew Lepus barnacles on buoys to see how fast they grew. And then he looked at the size of barnacles on these drift nets, first of all, to determine how long they'd been floating. And then he used reverse drift modeling to work backwards where they had come from. There was a paper published in Italy about 10 years ago, actually, where a biologist looked at barnacles growing on a corpse that the authorities had found. It was a dead body.
Wow.
And the idea was like, well, how long has this dead body been floating around? Like, where should we look for the murderer?
Wow.
So there's all kinds of ways that would be useful. These things are like natural data loggers.
And what's interesting about them, I think, is that their growth is not linear. They start slow in the beginning as they're getting established, and then they grow really quickly. And then after a few weeks or a few months, they slow down, and eventually they reach their maximum size and just stay there.
A lot of things grow like this. You know, even humans, right? We start off as little babies and we kind of grow pretty fast, and then we kind of enter like a fairly slow growth. And then you get to be 18, 19, you know, and it slows down. You sort of become your normal height. Barnacles do a similar thing. They grow really fast when they're young, and then they kind of peter out. And why this is significant is because once they get to the sort of equivalent of 17 or 18 years old, you can't really use their size to tell you about their age anymore. Like if I tell you that my kid is, you know, 4'8", you can probably guess how old they are. But if I tell you my kid is 5'10", not really.
Yeah, it could have been teenager all the way up to age 80. You know, you just
so basically, all of these dating methods we've talked about, dendrochronology, radiocarbon dating, these are useful for a certain time frame.
I feel like you just said something really important.
What's that?
Well, there's only a period of time in which you can tell how old and how big a piece of Lepus is.
Yeah, and that's why we're having to lay the case, because this is only going to be useful for a particular period of time. And one of the questions that's going to be asked is the data that you have applicable to the question at hand?
Yeah, and that leads to point 4, which actually it's amazing that the case of MH370 restarted this very niche part of science. But when the flaperon was discovered on La Réunion, very little research on these kind of barnacles had been done. Like the French researchers had to go back to the 1950s to even find a piece of research or a paper talking about this kind of Lepus growth. And you've alluded to this before, but this ignited, I mean, there are more marine biologists studying this now than there were 10 years ago.
There's been more work done in the last 10 years than had been done in human history up to that point. There just hadn't been a sense of urgency. These things were well known. Darwin wrote about them. They kind of have an interesting life history. It's sort of fascinating to think that they're a kind of crustacean. They look like a mollusk, but they're actually more related to shrimp than to clams. But nobody had really had a sense of urgency about asking, well, how quickly do these things grow? Because there hadn't been any real reason. But then once this piece washed ashore, people found themselves wondering, well, okay, we've had these things, they're a certain size. And what they found was that there were a lot of shells. A lot of these Lepus were about 25 millimeters, 2.5 centimeters. The very biggest one was 36 millimeters.
Yeah, they had to go back to a 1958 paper to plot out the growth. I mean,
it was a very short kind of, a thinly sourced paper where a guy had sort of asked this question without really having many resources to answer it. And he had referred to some other, even thinner research and established how quickly do things grow in the first, say, 5 months or 3 months, really. And there was only 3 data points. The researcher who was looking at the flaperon barnacles kind of extrapolated it out and said, well, if these things grow at a certain rate, then presumably the 36 millimeter barnacle must have started growing when the object went in the water. So he kind of
Alas,
extrapolated a growth rate based on the assumption that the biggest barnacle had started to grow when the piece went in the water.
and alas, there's a catch, and that's point number 5, and
Mm-hmm.
that's that lepus grow differently according to the water temperature and the nutrient density
Yeah,
in that
that's
water.
right. That's
and
right.
that was something that was not really reflected in this 1958 paper.
Yeah. It's a totally different ocean, a different latitude, different temperature. So one thing that people have learned in the intervening decades since the flaperon turned up is that it really matters where you study these growth. There's a team led by Henry Gulick, was looking at lepus that grew in the cold waters of the Humboldt Current off the coast of Chile. And they found that after 3 months of growth, which is how long their study ran, the lepus seemed to have petered out at about 20 millimeters. This is significantly smaller than the barnacles that were on the flaperon. Then another researcher looked at how a related species called Lepus anserifera, he grew them near Sydney. So this is southeastern Australia, and the waters are much warmer than the Humboldt Current, and they got to 48 millimeters in as little as a month. So again, it's like all over the map. And so basically, if you want to use these things as a timer, you have to have a kind of a reference. You have to know what the base rate is in that ocean, given the temperature and so these animals, as we've talked about in the past, they filter the water and they grab things that are swimming past and they eat them.
The sixth and final point comes from just 2020. So this is very new information. This is the first time that these experimental results were published, and they actually looked at barnacle growth in the same ocean that the flaperon drifted through.
Martin Stelfox, who runs an organization that is devoted to preserving sea turtles, he led a team that grew he grew Lepus barnacles on buoys. He wanted to understand how quickly they grew. Basically, he was taking the step of establishing a baseline so that he could then do the second part of his experiment, which is to find these ghost nets, measure the barnacles on them, deduce how long they had been growing by comparing them to his. As you see this chart, it shows the sort of average size of the barnacles that he was growing with time. And you can see, we've talked about, they started growing slowly, like a baby grows slowly. And then they sort of, as they got big, they got, they're kind of growing exponentially faster. Then they start to kind of level out. And by the time his experiment ended at 110 days, they had kind of entered this sort of steady growth rate that was a little bit lower than it had been. And so he was able to then go and compare these to barnacles found growing on these nets. And he could say, okay, listen, we'll look at the chart. If the average barnacle on your net is 20 millimeters, it's the capitulum. We can put up a diagram of what these animals look like. The length of the longest axis of these shells is called the capitulum. And if that is 20 millimeters, and then you go across and you can see that they start getting to 20 millimeters at about 49 days, and by about 63 days or 70 days they've gone past it. So you know that your net has been drifting for about that amount of time. It's not a precise estimate, but it gives you an idea. It gives you a time frame. Okay,
so if I'm reading this right, the average size of the barnacles in these graphs is 28 millimeters by the end of the experiment at 110 days, and the largest specimen was 35 millimeters.
Right. So basically, he designated a certain population of lepus, and then he looked at those individuals and he took their average. Lepus are like people. They're like a lot of organisms. They're not all the same. They're not clones of each other, and some grow faster and some grow not as fast. Even though they're the same age, they can be different sizes. And so the way you can address the question of how big is my lepus, which is going to closely tie into the question of how old they are, you can either look at the average of a population or you can just look at the largest individual. And each has its advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of looking at just the biggest one is that it's easy. You just find the biggest shell on the object and you measure it. Boom, you're done. The problem is that there's a population effect whereby if you think about like the tallest kid in your homeroom, he
Right.
was probably significantly taller than the average. But if you talk about the tallest person on your college campus, right, where
Yes.
you've got the basketball team and everything,
Right.
you're going to have somebody who's crazy tall, like way many standard deviations taller than the average, and so you're going to have an effect where barnacles will seem bigger just because they come from a bigger population. If you just look at the average, it's going to be more robust in correlating age to time.
For sure. Now, all of this is intriguingly similar in the size of the barnacles found on the flaperon, but
Right.
you do not have to be. I mean, I hope it's obvious where we're going with this, but we're talking about time that the
Right.
barnacles had to grow, what size they grew to, how long the flaperon was in the water before it was found, and how that doesn't match with the drift modeling and when the plane crashed. I mean, there's some major inconsistencies here that we're going to talk about and get into even more detail into the next episode.
People might be tempted to leap
Leap.
ahead and
Yes.
say,
Okay.
listen, Martin Stelfox grew his barnacles in a stretch of water that is similar to where the flaperon washed up. Not the same. The Maldives are actually in the northern, they're above the equator, and La Reunion is south of the equator. And Maldives are and they're like, they're closer to the equator, so that the temperatures are warmer. But there was another Japanese study that was done in the last few years where they looked at how temperature affected growth rate. And they found that in between 20 degrees and 30 degrees Celsius, the temperature didn't really affect the growth rate in a significant way. The argument is that these things should be growing about the same rate as the flaperon barnacles. Okay. And so that means that Stelfox's barnacles are about this, the average size is similar to the large number of barnacles that were growing on the flaperon. His maximum size was 35 millimeters. The flaperon was 36 millimeters, very, very close. So you might be tempted to think, well, the flaperon barnacles look about the same size, and they're probably the same age. But that's getting ahead of yourself because remember, you can only use the size of Lepus as a timing mechanism within a certain time frame. As the barnacles approach their maximum size, they no longer change with time, and they can no longer be used as a clock. So the question is, what is the time frame? Are the flaperon barnacles within that time frame, or are they too old? If it seems like we've been overly laborious in walking you through this, it's because we are putting a lever under a very large rock and we're trying to move the rock, and we need to have a strong lever. Again, I am not a Lepus expert. I am a journalist, and no one should take my word for it. I have to talk to people who really know this stuff. So actually, I reached out to Martin Stelfox. I did a video interview with him, and I want you to hear what he had to say. Dr. Stelfox, you're the founder and executive director of the Olive Ridley Project, which is an environmental protection organization specifically focused at marine life, and you really started because of your concern for sea turtles. Is that right?
Yeah, that is, yeah, pretty much right. We initially started the program exclusively looking at one threat to sea turtles, which was the threat of fishing gear. So that's where the project started. And then since
I
then,
see.
we've expanded and took a more holistic approach. Yeah.
One of the things you're concerned about are ghost nets, which some people might not have heard of. This is fishing gear, fishing nets, things that are abandoned, or how do they come to be in the water?
Yeah, so abandoned, lost, or discarded fishing gear can also be referred to as ghost gear.
Mm-hmm.
There's various reasons why active fishing gear can suddenly become inactive. It could be through operational damage. So maybe there's some trawling, and when they winch the nets back into the boat, pieces or fragments of the net break away.
So you've been studying these drift nets for a long time, trying to both study them but also to mitigate against them. You want to figure out where they come from in order so you can sort of try to do something about it. How did you come across the idea of using Lepus barnacles as a kind of natural data logger?
Yeah, I mean that's one technique to try and identify where ghost gear is potentially coming from. And by the way, it's still extremely difficult to identify with precision, where ghost nets may originate from in terms of exact fishery. But the reason the idea of barnacles came to light was because when I was working in the Maldives as a biologist, we were finding a lot of fishing nets entangling sea turtles. But what I was also noticing is when we were removing the fishing gear, there was a lot of bioaccumulation on the net. So this is things like algae, barnacles, various different things that are growing on the surface of this plastic. So it triggered a thought process to me to think, well, maybe there's a way that we can look at the stuff that's growing on the nets and see if we can maybe look at an age processing technique to identify how long it may have been drifting for.
I thought it was interesting. There has been a lot of research into Lepus antitifera and related species since the disappearance of MH370. I think a lot of attention was put on the Lepus that were growing on the flaperon and other pieces of debris. And the idea that, oh, hey, these things actually are sort of a store of information about the environment. Maybe it's a clue.
It's a pretty good indicator to give us an idea of how long things have been drifting for.
So if your aim is to use Lepus, a community of Lepus as a kind of clock, it would be nice to have a kind of a baseline to understand, a kind of reference population that how long it's been growing for. You used these fixed, you grew them on buoys, I guess, basically, because, practically speaking, you can't just go drift around the ocean. But if you had a kind of reference of something that was floating in the ocean in those same waters, that would be a very useful baseline, wouldn't it?
Yeah, if you could potentially look at a way of tracking any sort of material over time and taking samples over specific time intervals as it's naturally drifting with currents, that would be a bit more accurate. Obviously, what comes with that is cost. It would be a very expensive experiment because you'd need the resources to be out at sea and then also the resources to track it through technology as well.
So I think the idea that I think people should understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that these barnacles do grow at a fairly reliable and predictable way, but within the context of a given environment. If you put them in a certain environment, then they can be used as a clock. But you need to have a reference to understand how they grow in that environment.
Yeah, I mean, the different environmental conditions that barnacles are exposed to would dictate certain kind of variables within how you predict a growth pattern.
Yeah, so it seems like one of the really interesting questions about using Lepus as a clock is the question of when or at what point does the growth level off? Because once it levels off, you can't really use it as a clock anymore because different sizes correlate with different ages or no longer correlate with different ages. Now, I looked at your data and it was interesting to me. It seemed to me like your experiment went to 110 days. It seemed like your last data point was kind of linear. It seemed like it was still going. And certainly these barnacles have been known to get up to around 5 centimeters. And your biggest one, I think, was 3.5.
Yeah, I think there's no question that likely, if given a bit more time, that barnacle or those barnacles could have got a little bit bigger. So outside of the experiment, on personal observations, some of the barnacles we've seen in the Maldives were much bigger than the barnacles we've been experimenting in. So for sure, these barnacles can grow pretty quickly over a very short space of time.
It is interesting that you are able to get within a certain error bar, because some grow faster than others. You can determine how long these things have been floating with some degree of confidence, which I think is kind of amazing.
Yeah, it's a fairly reliable way to give you an idea of how long that gear has been drifting for. And again, we can then use that age estimate to then plug into things like drifting current models and start to backtrack where potentially this gear may have come from behind in time.
So I really want to thank Dr. Stelfox for taking the time to talk to me. Understanding the natural world is a laborious process. You have to spend months you are hanging out at the Maldives, so it could be worse. You have to really take the time to study these things in detail, understand the context that they're living in. And from that, once you understand these patterns, then you can start to draw inferences from the outer world. So this is the great thing about science, is that Martin Stelfox had a question that he wanted to answer. He wanted to understand where these drift nets are coming from. And he found his information, he found his answer, and then he shared it with the world. And now we can use that information for a completely different purpose. So he really gave us the gift of I think, an important building block in our understanding of what happened to MH370.
After watching the Netflix special, I went back and looked at my browser history, and it was immediately the next day I ordered this book, and it answered a lot of these questions. A lot of the stuff we're talking about is in this very easy to read book, but there is definitely some new stuff, and that's what's going on in Deep Dive MH370.
Yeah.
So we'll put a link to that in the podcast.
Thank you.